On December 10th, 1936, King Edward VIII sat before a microphone in Windsor Castle and spoke the words that would end the British monarchy as it had been known for 1,000 years. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. The broadcast crackled across the empire. In drawing rooms from London to Sydney, people wept. The newspapers called it the greatest love story of the century. A king who gave up everything for romance. But 700 miles away in Cannes, the woman he'd abdicated for was not weeping tears of joy. Wallis Simpson was sobbing in horror. 2 days earlier, she had written to her husband Ernest, the man she was divorcing to marry Edward. I feel small and licked by it all. I really can't concentrate on anything. I am terrified of the court. This wasn't the reaction of a scheming social climber who'd just won a crown. This was a woman who'd lost control of her own life. The story we've been told about Wallis Simpson goes like this. She was an ambitious American divorcee who seduced a weak king, forcing Britain to choose between monarchy and modernisation. The establishment rejected her because she was divorced, because she was American, because she threatened the sanctity of the crown. But that's not the whole truth. The question isn't whether British society rejected Wallis Simpson. Everyone knows they did. The real question is far more unsettling. Was she hated because she was an American divorcee, or because British society sensed something genuinely dangerous about her? Because when we look at what people actually said at the time, when we read the intelligence files that have since been declassified, when we examine the private letters that weren't meant to be seen, a very different picture emerges. This is the story of a woman who British aristocracy despised for reasons that had nothing to do with romance. A woman British intelligence considered an active threat to national security. A woman so toxic that Winston Churchill, who initially defended Edward's right to marry, came to see her as potentially catastrophic for Britain's survival. The contemporary evidence tells us something that the love story narrative obscures. The establishment's rejection of Wallis Simpson may have saved Britain from disaster. To understand what British society really thought of Wallis Simpson, we need to start where they started, with class. Bessie Wallace Warfield was born in Pennsylvania in 1896 to a family that wasn't quite poor, but definitely wasn't rich. Her father died of tuberculosis 5 months after her birth, leaving her mother an 18-year-old widow dependent on the charity of relatives. She attended the right schools, moved in the right circles, but she was always the poor relation, the one who needed things, and British aristocracy could smell it. Here's what matters. Between the 1870s and World War I, over 350 American women married into British nobility. Jenny Jerome became Winston Churchill's mother. Consuelo Vanderbilt became the Duchess of Marlborough. Nancy Astor became the first woman to sit in Parliament. The British establishment had no problem with Americans marrying into their families, but every single one of those women had something Wallis didn't: serious money. They were heiresses who could rescue crumbling estates with their dowries. They had the kind of wealth that bought acceptance. Wallis had wit, charm, and entertaining skills. She'd been accepted in London's social circles before Edward became obsessed with her. Society hostesses enjoyed her company, but the moment she became linked to the heir to the throne, everything changed. A courtier described her as hard-hearted, tough, scheming, and wildly ambitious. Another said she was neither beautiful nor brilliant. The phrase repeated again and again in contemporary accounts is social climber. This was class snobbery in its purest form. She wasn't being rejected because she was divorced. She was being rejected because her manners were considered vulgar. Because she came from new money Baltimore, not old money Boston. Because she'd been married to a Navy pilot and a shipping executive, not to anyone who mattered. Queen Mary, Edward's mother, captured this perfectly. She never once spoke Wallis's name. She called her that woman, not the American, not the divorcee, that woman. The contempt was personal and visceral. This was a woman who didn't know her place, trying to take the highest place in the realm. But there was something beneath the class hatred, something that made the establishment's reaction even more intense. In August 1938, French intelligence reported to MI6 that Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe was almost certain to be an important German agent. Wallis Simpson was on the list of her known associates. This wasn't paranoia. Let's be clear about what British intelligence knew and when they knew it. Robert Vansittart, permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, reported to Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin that Wallis was passing information to the German government. Not suspected of passing information, was passing information. The response was immediate and practical. Red boxes containing classified government documents that were sent to Fort Belvedere, where Edward lived, were carefully screened by the Foreign Office to ensure nothing highly secret should go astray. Think about that for a moment. The heir to the British throne, and later the king himself, was being treated as a security risk. His lover's residence was being monitored. The government was actively preventing sensitive information from reaching him. Metropolitan Police Special Branch followed Wallis secretly and produced reports on the nature of her relationship with Edward and details of her private life. This wasn't routine surveillance of someone dating the king. This was active intelligence gathering on a perceived threat. Then there was Joachim von Ribbentrop, who would become Hitler's foreign minister. The FBI files reported what British intelligence already knew. Wallis and Ribbentrop had been intimate. There was a famous rumour that he sent 17 red roses to her flat in London. Each rose supposedly represented an occasion they'd slept together. Paul Schwartz, who worked in Ribbentrop's Foreign Office, later reported that secrets from British dispatch boxes were circulating in Berlin. Materials sent by Britain's ambassador to Germany were making their way back to the Nazi government, and the implication was clear. Wallis was the leak. By 1936, when the abdication crisis exploded, British intelligence had concluded something that wouldn't be fully confirmed until after the war. The woman Edward wanted to marry was, at minimum, wildly indiscreet with Nazi officials, and at worst, an active sympathizer passing state secrets to Germany. The FBI put it bluntly in a file reported to Franklin Roosevelt. It has been ascertained that for some time the British government has known that the Duchess of Windsor was exceedingly pro-German in her sympathies and connections, and there is a strong reason to believe that this is the reason why she was considered so obnoxious to the British government that they refused to permit Edward to marry her and maintain the throne. So when we ask why the establishment rejected Wallis so forcefully, we have to consider this. They weren't just rejecting a divorced American, they were rejecting a woman their intelligence services considered a genuine security threat at the exact moment when war with Germany was becoming inevitable. There's a particular kind of cruelty that reveals character, how someone treats people who can't fight back. The royal household staff noticed something immediately when Edward became infatuated with Wallis. He cut servants' wages. Then he spent their time loading furniture, plates and cases of champagne for dispatch to Mrs. Simpson's flat. The resentment wasn't about him having a mistress. Royal mistresses were nothing new. The resentment was about the petty meanness of it. Edward even issued an instruction that used soap bars should be reclaimed for his own use, rather than left for the servants. This wasn't economy, this was humiliation. But Wallis herself was worse. Paul Foote, analysing her character from contemporary accounts, concluded she was a racist through and through, anti-Semitic, except when she hoped to benefit from rich Jewish friends, and anti-black. She was offensive to her servants and hated the class they came from. When Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1940, Wallis wrote that government house with only a coloured staff would put me in my grave. Her French household staff, after the abdication, reported that Edward insisted they call Wallis Son Altesse Royale, Her Royal Highness, even though King George VI had explicitly denied her that title. Servants who worked for her described treatment that was cruel and despotic, a woman who reserved all her charm for people who mattered and showed nothing but contempt for those who didn't. This matters because it tells us something the love story obscures. Wallis Simpson wasn't just controversial because of who she was disliked because of what she was. The class snobbery of the aristocracy was matched by the genuine dislike of people who actually had to deal with her. The crisis that destroyed Edward's kingship played out across 7 weeks in late 1936, but the moment that crystallised everything happened on October 27th. Wallis sat in a courtroom in Ipswich Assizes, testifying at her divorce hearing. The evidence presented was clearly collusion. Her husband, Ernest Simpson, had arranged to be caught with a woman called Mrs. Buttercup Kennedy in a hotel. The whole thing was theatre, designed to give Wallis grounds for divorce under British law. 2 days before that hearing, Wallis had written to Ernest, "I feel small and licked by it all. I really can't concentrate on anything. I am terrified of the court." This is the moment we need to understand, because the popular narrative says Wallis manipulated Edward into abdicating so she could be queen. But the secret letters discovered in 2011 tell a completely different story. Wallis didn't want to marry Edward. She wanted to stay his mistress. She'd written to him begging to be content with the simple way. But Edward was obsessed. He threatened suicide if she left him. He told Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin he would abdicate if he couldn't marry her. And Wallis, trapped between a man who threatened to kill himself and a government that wouldn't bend, wrote to Ernest in October 1938, "I shan't write about it again. It is painful and it is too late." She loved Ernest. The marriage they'd had was, as Ernest himself put it, so frightfully congenial. When he remarried in November 1937, it was to Mary Kirk, one of Wallis's oldest friends from school. Ernest had moved on. Wallis was stuck. Meanwhile, the political machinery was moving. Baldwin consulted the Dominions: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Irish Free State. Every single one opposed the marriage. William Lyon Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister, reported that the Canadian public would be outraged. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, was unequivocal. The Church of England did not permit remarriage while an ex-spouse was still alive. As head of the Church, Edward could not violate this rule and remain king. On November 16th, Edward told Baldwin he intended to marry Wallis, regardless of the consequences. Baldwin told him that would require abdication. For 3 weeks, Edward refused to back down. Wallis fled to France, hiding from the press, writing desperate letters. On December 3rd, the British press finally broke the story they'd been suppressing for months. The public outcry was immediate. The objections weren't primarily about divorce or nationality. The opposition came from something deeper: fear. Fear that normalizing divorce at the highest level would destabilize the entire institution of marriage. Fear of leaving deserted wives destitute and children without stable homes. Fear that this American woman with her Nazi connections was dangerous. On December 10th, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. The next day, he gave his radio broadcast and left Britain. What nobody knew then was that the intelligence service's worst fears about Wallis and Edward's Nazi sympathies would be completely validated. When we ask what British society really thought of Wallis Simpson, we need to understand that there wasn't one answer. There were many, and they were often contradictory. The royal family's hatred was personal, deep, and permanent. Queen Mary never forgave either of them. She'd presented Wallis at Buckingham Palace in 1935 in a brief attempt at civility, but after the abdication, she never spoke to Wallis again. She thought the wedding date, June 3rd, 1937, King George V's birthday, was a deliberate insult. She didn't attend the wedding. She called Wallis "that woman" until the day she died. George VI's feelings were even more complex. He'd never been trained to be king. He was shy, had a severe stammer, and never wanted the burden. But when Edward abdicated, George had no choice. The stress of being thrust into kingship, of leading Britain through World War II, probably killed him. He died in 1952 at only 56 years old. George VI asked his Home Secretary and Lord Chancellor how he could legally deny Wallis the title Her Royal Highness. He wanted to know, is she a fit and proper person to become a Royal Highness after what she has done? He prohibited any member of the royal family from attending the wedding. He allowed Edward to visit informally, but never Wallis. And then there was the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. Her hatred of Wallis lasted her entire life. She blamed Wallis for her husband's early death, for destroying the peaceful life they'd planned, for making her daughters lose their father when they were young. She said it explicitly: "The two people who have caused me the most trouble in my life are Wallis Simpson and Hitler." Even in her dementia in old age, servants reported that Elizabeth would insult photographs of Wallis. When Edward died in 1972, the royal family allowed Wallis to stay at Buckingham Palace for the funeral, but they left her alone there for an entire weekend. After the funeral, palace staff escorted her immediately to the airport. The royal family never forgave, never accepted, never relented. Churchill's position was more complicated. Before the abdication, he was Edward's only significant political supporter. He defended the king's right to marry whom he chose. But after the abdication, after Churchill saw the intelligence files, after the Marburg files were discovered in Germany in 1945, everything changed. The Marburg Files were German diplomatic documents detailing Operation Willy, the Nazi plan to kidnap or persuade the Duke of Windsor to collaborate with Germany. The documents showed that Edward had told Nazi officials that continued heavy bombing will make England ready for peace, that the Nazis planned to reinstall him as a puppet king, with Wallis as queen. Churchill was horrified. In July 1940, he ordered Edward out of Europe and appointed him governor of the Bahamas, not as an honour, but to remove him from the continent where the Nazis might capture him. He threatened court-martial if Edward didn't comply. Then, Churchill tried to suppress the Marburg Files. He wrote personally to Eisenhower in 1953, calling the documents biased and unreliable and asking that they not be published for at least 10 or 20 years. Churchill had concluded that Edward, with Wallis's influence, would have been catastrophic for Britain during the war. The woman he'd once defended had become, in his eyes, a liability that could have cost Britain its survival. For MI5 and MI6, Wallis wasn't a romantic figure or a social climber. She was an active security threat. The surveillance was extensive. The screening of documents sent to Edward was standard practice. When Vansittart reported his suspicions to Baldwin, the government took them seriously enough to alter security protocols around the king himself. After the war, when the full extent of Edward and Wallis's Nazi connections became clear, the intelligence service's assessment was vindicated. They've been right to be afraid. The people who actually had to work for Wallis uniformly described her as cruel, racist, and contemptuous. This wasn't about her nationality or marital status. This was about character. The contrast between her behaviour toward powerful people and her treatment of servants revealed something the romantic narrative couldn't accommodate. She was fundamentally unkind. The British press maintained a total blackout on the Edward-Wallis relationship until December 1936. The government had instructed them not to report it. When the story finally broke, the coverage was savage. Terms like Yankee harlot appeared. The emphasis was on duty abandoned, monarchy threatened. The American press had been covering the romance since 1934 with a completely different tone. Cinderella story, local girl made good, romance conquering all. Time magazine made Wallis Woman of the Year in 1936. The cultural difference was stark. In Britain, the emphasis was on duty. To abandon duty was unforgivable. In America, the emphasis was on romance. To abandon a throne for love was heroic. When the public finally learned about the relationship, polling and contemporary accounts suggest they were mostly opposed, not primarily because of divorce or nationality, but because of what it represented: instability, the normalization of divorce, and genuine uncertainty about this American woman's character and loyalties. Lord Tweedsmuir reported from Canada that public opinion would be outraged. The Dominions unanimously opposed the marriage. The establishment's resistance had public support. Edward and Wallis married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France. No member of the royal family attended. The Church of England didn't approve it. Edward insisted the household staff call her Her Royal Highness, but George VI had legally denied her the title. They would remain married for 35 years, until Edward's death in 1972. Whether Wallis ever grew to love him, we can't know. She stayed, she performed the role, but those early letters to Ernest suggest she was trapped by circumstances she couldn't control. In October 1937, they visited Nazi Germany. Photographs show Edward giving full Nazi salutes, spending 2 hours in conversation with Hitler. In 1939, Edward recorded a BBC broadcast suggesting that Britain should come to terms with Nazi Germany. The BBC refused to air it, archiving it with a note, important not to be broadcast. When we ask what British society really thought of Wallis Simpson, the answer is they thought she was dangerous, and they were right. The class snobbery was real. The religious objections were genuine. But beneath all of that was something more serious. British intelligence, the royal family, and eventually Winston Churchill all concluded that Wallis Simpson, with her Nazi sympathies and her hold over Edward, represented a genuine threat to Britain's survival. The establishment didn't just reject her because she was an American divorcee. They rejected her because every instinct, every intelligence report, every observation of her character told them she was wrong, toxic, dangerous. The great irony is that the Queen Mother's personal pain, losing her husband to the stress of unexpected kingship, probably saved Britain. If Edward had remained king during World War II, with Wallis whispering in his ear and the Nazis calculating how to use them, the outcome might have been very different. George VI, shy and stammering and never wanting the burden, became exactly the king Britain needed during its darkest hour. His wife Elizabeth, who hated Wallis for destroying their peaceful life, became a symbol of British resilience during the Blitz. The abdication that seemed like a constitutional crisis in 1936 was, in retrospect, a blessing. Wallis Simpson died in Paris on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89. She'd spent her last 8 years bedridden with dementia. The royal family finally allowed her to be buried next to Edward at Windsor. Even at the end, even with Edward decades dead, the Queen Mother's contempt never wavered. The question we started with was whether Wallis was hated because she was an American divorcee, or because British society sensed something genuinely dangerous about her. The answer, uncomfortable as it is both. The class snobbery was real and ugly. The moral objections to divorce were genuine, but also convenient. The anti-American sentiment existed, but beneath all of that, the establishment's instincts were correct. The intelligence service's suspicions were vindicated. Churchill's eventual assessment was accurate. Wallis Simpson wasn't just a woman who fell in love with a king. She was a woman whose character, connections, and influence represented a genuine threat at the most dangerous moment in British history. The love story narrative is compelling because it's simple. Romance versus duty, modernization versus tradition, individual choice versus institutional obligation. But the truth is more unsettling. Sometimes the establishment's worst instincts point toward a real danger. Sometimes the system's rejection of an outsider is justified not by their prejudices, but by genuine threat assessment. British society rejected Wallis Simpson for many reasons. Some of those reasons were indefensible class snobbery and moral rigidity, but some of those reasons were a collective recognition that this woman, with this man, at this moment in history, could destroy everything. They weren't wrong.